B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Moed Katan Daf Yud Beis. We're going to start at the very top of the Omid. We mentioned on Daf Yud Aleph that there's a concept called a kablon. A kablon is somebody who's been contracted to do a job and gets paid when the job is done. Omar Shmuel. Shmuel said, Mekabli kiboiles. You're allowed to contract a goy that he should do work for you, even though he may do the work on Shabbos. As long as the deal was done before Shabbos, on Shabbos you're not allowed to tell a guy on Shabbos to work for you. But as long as you do the deal before Shabbos, then even though the guy is going to work on Shabbos, that's okay. Mekable kiboiles, besoichat tchum. However, if it's within the tchum, if the guy is working for the Yisrael within the 2,000 amos around a place where Yidden are living, Osir, it's Osir, because people will see him working for the Yisrael on Shabbos, and people will say that maybe this guy was contracted on Shabbos, and that's Osir. Chutz l'tchum, however, if it's outside the tchum, mutter, you're allowed to do that. Omer of Papa. Rav Papa added, Vafilu chutz l'tchum, even outside the tchum, where nobody is allowed to leave from the tchum. Every person, wherever he is, when Shabbos comes in, he's not allowed to walk outside the tchum on Shabbos, and therefore, if it's outside the tchum, no Yidden will see him. But Rav Papa says that even outside the tchum, lo omron elo deleka mosa de mekar v'lehosom. It's only true that outside the tchum, the guy can do the work for you on Shabbos, only if that place where the guy is doing the work is not close enough to a different town. If it's within 2,000 amos of a different town, then the Yidden of a different place would come and see this guy working for the Yisrael in this town, and that would be an issue. Aval Ika Mosa, if there's a town, the Mekar v'lehosom, that's close to the place where the guy is working, and within 2,000 amos of that place, then even though it's further than 2,000 amos from the place of the person who has contracted these goyim, Osir, it's still Osir. Omer of Mesharshia. Mesharshia said, Kileka Mosa de Mekar v'lehosom nami, even in a place where it's outside the tchum, and no Yid can leave on Shabbos and see these goyim working, and therefore it's okay. That only helps on Shabbos and Yom Tov. It's very rare, it's not common for Yisrael to be there. There are these rare circumstances where Yisrael could go outside his 2,000 amos, and if he makes an Eruv, we learnt about that in Maseches Eruvin. But the general people cannot get to that place, so it's okay. That's only on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Aval b'choyle shel moed, but on Chol HaMoed, the shchicha insha on Chol HaMoed, as far as going outside the tchum, there's no issue. Anyone can go wherever they want, and therefore the Yidden will see the goyim working for this Yisrael on Chol HaMoed. The shchicha insha the ozlu v'asu lahosom. There are people who come and go from that place, and osir. Therefore, it's osir because a Yid is not allowed to ask a goy to do a malacha for him on Chol HaMoed. And even though he may have been contracted before, but people won't know that. They'll see a guy working for Yisrael on Chol HaMoed, and that's awesome. Continues the Gemara, Mar Zutra Bereder of Nachman, Bonu le apadno, mekable kiboiles chutz l'tchum. This Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, he contracted people to build a palace for him, a mansion for him, and they built this outside the tchum. It was outside the place where the Yidden could go. And they built it on Shabbos. Nothing wrong with that. We said before that Mekable Kiboiles outside the Tchum is mutter. Ikler of Safra Rav Huna bar Chinana. So Rav Safra and Rav Huna bar Chinana chanced upon this mansion at some point. They refused to go into this mansion because they said that this mansion was built on Shabbos. And others say that even Mar Zutra himself, who owned this mansion, he also didn't go into his own mansion that was built for him. He refused to go in it. Why? It was built on Shabbos. But the Gemara is asking now a question. Did Shmuel not say Did Shmuel not say that if these kablonim, they're not paid to do it now, here, today, They were paid to do the job. They can do the job whenever they want. They chose to do it on Shabbos, and that's okay. It was outside the Tchum. There's no problem of people seeing them building. What was the issue? Why did Mar Zutra not go into, according to some, why did Rav Safra and Rav Huna not go into this mansion? What's going on? Answers the Gemara, Odom Choshuv Shani. A prominent person should avoid having Goyim working for him, even though it's mutter, it's outside the Tchum, it's only kablonus. Nonetheless, a prominent person should not make use of such a mansion. Others say, some say that Rav Mar Zutra, who owned this mansion, he actually supplied them with straw, with the materials they needed to build the mansion, and therefore, even though he didn't tell them to build on Shabbos, that wasn't an instruction, he just happened to be that he supplied them with some of the materials. But since he had a hand in the materials that were used to build the mansion on Shabbos, then he did not want to have any use of it, and he didn't go into it. Continues the Gemara. Rav Chama Shoraluhu La'ambungari. Ambungari were the people who were taking care of the tables, the Bei Resh Galusa, in the home of the Resh Galusa, the head of the Golus. Rav Chama allowed these workers to fix the tables even on Chol HaMoed. Omar, Rav Chama said, Kiven da'agar lo koshokli. Since these workers, they were not getting paid a regular paycheck, they were not given money as payment. Rather, they had an indirect gain, that as payment, so to speak, for their work, they could eat with the family of the Resh Galusa, and that would be their payment. And since they didn't get proper payment, it's not considered that they were doing a melacha, that they were working on Chol HaMoed. No, and therefore, v'les lon ba, and therefore, he allowed them to fix the tables. And obviously, they fixed the tables. L'tzorech HaMoed, it was done. They needed the tables to eat on Chol HaMoed, and then on Yom Tov. Tonu Rabbanon, says the Gemara. We learned in a Brisa, Mekablin kiboiles b'moed, that you're allowed to sign a contract with a goy on Chol HaMoed, la'soiso la'achar HaMoed, in order that the work will be done, or for work that will be done after Yom Tov. You're allowed to sign a contract with a goy on Chol HaMoed. You're not allowed to tell him to do the work on Chol HaMoed. But if he's doing the work after Yom Tov, you're allowed to sign the contract on Chol HaMoed. U'b'moed asur. However, to do the work on Chol HaMoed, that's not allowed. Klolei shel davar, what's the rule? The rule is that kol shehu oisa, anything that the Yisrael himself is allowed to do on Chol HaMoed, with all the conditions that we've learned about Hilchas Chol HaMoed, omer lenochri v'oisa, you can tell a guy to do it for you on Chol HaMoed. V'chol she'ein oisa, but anything that Yisrael himself is not allowed to do, he's not allowed to tell the goy to do it for him on Chol HaMoed. Continues the Gemara Tanya Idach, another brisa regarding the halachas of Chol HaMoed. Mekablim kiboiles b'moed. You're allowed to sign a contract with the goy on Chol HaMoed, la'soiso la'achar HaMoed, so that he will do the work after Chol HaMoed, after Yom Tov. Ubilvad, however, even though it's common when you sign the contract that there's a certain amount of measuring, of weighing, of counting that's done in order to sign the deal, that you should not do on Chol HaMoed. Ubilvad shelo yimdoid, on condition that you do not measure, shelo yishkel, you do not weigh, v'shelo yimne, you do not count, kederech she'oise b'chol, in the way that he would on a regular weekday. So you can make the deal with him, but don't be engaged in the preparations that you would typically do during the week. Tonu Rabbanon, another brisa, ein marvi'in behema, one's not allowed to mount you're not allowed to hold a female animal and mount the male animal onto her, b'chol shel moed, because that's considered as effort, it's considered as work, and you're not allowed to do that. Kiyotze boy, another somewhat related halacha, ein marvi'in b'b'chol, you're not allowed to mount an animal, a male, onto a female if it's a firstborn animal. A firstborn animal, which is going to be a korban, you're not allowed to do any work with it, and this is called making the animal work by mounting it and then causing offspring. And even those korbanos which they became possible, they had a permanent blemish in them, and you're allowed to redeem them. However, you're not allowed to do work with them, and therefore you're not allowed to mount them onto each other because that's considered that you're making them work. You're not allowed to make them work. Continues the Gemara, another brayse Tanya Idach. Ein marvi'in behema b'choyle shel moed. You're not allowed to mount a male animal onto the female on Chol HaMoed. Rabbi Yehuda says there's an exception. Chamoira, a female donkey, shetovah, that she's asking, so to speak, she's asking for a male, or she's got that need to have a male mounted on her. Marvin ole zachar, you're allowed to mount the male on her, b'shvil shelo titztanin, in order that she should not cool down, because a female donkey that gets cooled down, afterwards it's very challenging, if at all possible, for her to get re-aroused, and then she may never ever have any offspring, and that's considered a davar oved, and you're allowed to prevent a loss by working on Chol HaMoed. V'shar kol behemoths, however, any other animals, you're not allowed to mount the male on the female. However, machnisin oison lebekores, you're allowed to put the animals, they should be together in the same pen, in the same enclosed area, and then they will mount on each other on their own, but that's as much as you can do. But you're not allowed to actually mount an animal onto another animal on Chol HaMoed. Continues the Gemara, Tonu Rabbanon, Ein medairin. Medairin means a deer is a pen, and typically they would move the pens around with the animals in order that the animals would manure the land. The waste of the animals would be very beneficial for the land. So are you allowed to move around these pens on Chol HaMoed in order that the animals should manure the field? So it says, Ein medairin loy b'shabbosos v'loy b'yomim tovim. You're not allowed to cause the animals, you're not allowed to bring the animals to a specific place in a field to manure it, not on Shabbos and not on Yom Tov, v'loy b'choyle shel moed, nor on Chol HaMoed. V'im bo'u me'elem, if Goyim brought the animals to your field on their own, you didn't tell them bring them now on Shabbos, bring them on Yom Tov, they came on their own, mutter, you're allowed to leave them there, it's okay. Ve'ein masayin oisoi, but you're not allowed to help them. You're not allowed to help the animals come into the fields. And in the case that it's goyim, if the animals come on their own, you're not allowed to help them. And if goyim are bringing them, you're not allowed to help them bring the animals from place to place. Ve'ein moisrim lehem shomer lenair es tzoinom. You're not allowed to give them a shomer, a guard, or somebody who's going to be menair. A menair, the Mefarshim explain, is that when the animals are constantly shaken and made to stand up, it helps them to pass their bowels and to manure the land, and you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Hoyos schir Shabbos, if this guy was employed, he was paid for a whole week to manure the land when necessary, or schir chodesh, or for a whole month at a time, or schir shana for a year at a time, or schir shavua for a 7-year period, Messiah Noison, then it's as if that the guy is doing it in his own field, he's doing his own job, and you're allowed to help him like you would be allowed to help any guy. And then you're allowed to actually give him a shomer, L'nair tzoinam, that's going to shake up the sheep, the flock, in order that they should manure the land. Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says that if they come on their own, then now, at the end of the day, these goyim are coming, bringing their animals to manure your field. How are you going to pay them back? So on Shabbos, if they're coming on Shabbos, b'toiva, you're allowed to give them back a favor, but not more than that. But Yom Tov, if they're doing it on Yom Tov, b'mazonos, then you're allowed to just give them food as a form of payment. B'moed, and if they come on Chol HaMoed, then b'schar, then you can give them proper payment. Omer Rav Yosef says, halachic Rebbe, the halacha is like we just saw now in the name of Rebbe. Continues the next Mishnah. V'chein mi shehaya yenoi b'soich haboir. This takes us back to, it's a continuation of the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis. We saw at the beginning of the Mishnah, on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, the beginning of the Perek, that somebody who had zeisim, olives, that had been turned over in the vat, and then for whatever reason he couldn't transfer those olives from the vat to the press, and then they would get ruined. And then we discussed whether he's allowed to put the olives into the press on Chol HaMoed or in a time of Avelis when he's in mourning. And now we're going to have a similar Mishnah, but not regarding the olives for oil, but grapes for wine. It's a person who had wine in the vat, Ve'ira, Avel, and he suddenly became an oval. One of his 7 close relatives passed away, father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, wife, or something else happened that he couldn't now take care of this wine, putting them into barrels and sealing it off, or if the workers promised they would come and do it and they let him down, then Zoileif v'goimer is allowed to pour over the wine into the barrels, v'gof kedarke, and he can seal the barrels in a regular way on Chol HaMoed. Divrei Rabbi Yosi, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yosi. As we saw that to the end of the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph on base, that's Rabbi Yosi's opinion, that you can do it, you can do the whole job in its regular fashion. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda already argued in the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph on base. Here again, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that since it's not necessary to seal those barrels properly on Chol HaMoed, it's enough to just prepare some boards of wood to put on top of the barrels that they on top of the barrels, on top of the vat where the wine is, in order that they should that the wine will not become sour. But you don't need to actually seal the barrels properly. Or says the Gemara Utzricha, why do we need 2 Mishnayos, one regarding olives for oil, the other regarding grapes for wine? Why do we need to have 2 Mishnayos saying the same thing? Utzricha, we need them both. Diyoshmin and Kamaisa, because if we only had the machlekes of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosi in the first Mishnah regarding oil, then I may have thought, Bahi Ka'am Rabbi Yosi, only regarding oil, Mishum Mishcha Nofish Pseide, because oil is more expensive than wine, and over there where there's a larger risk of a larger loss, there Rabbi Yosi says that you can take care of it kedarka in a regular fashion. Aval Chamra, but in the case of wine, Delay Nofish Pseida, which is not so expensive, I may have said, Moidulei Rabbi Yehuda, I'll agree to Rabbi Yehuda, that you cannot do it just everything as usual. And as Rabbi Yehuda said, that in the case of the wine, Rabbi Yehuda here said that you can't just close up and seal the barrel properly, you can just put some boards on top of it. V'yoshmin on Basraisa, and if the Mishnah would only tell us the machlekes in the second Mishnah regarding the wine, I may have said, by he called Rabbi Yehuda, only regarding the wine, which is less expensive, there Rabbi Yehuda said that you're only allowed to make boards, but you're not allowed to seal it properly. Avol bahach, but I may have said that maybe in the case of oil, which is a larger risk, a bigger loss if it gets ruined, I may have thought, that Rabbi Yehuda will agree to Rabbi Yosi that you can do everything in a regular fashion. Tzricha, that's why I need the Mishnah to tell us that even regarding the oil, Rabbi Yehuda says you're not allowed to do it in a regular fashion. Continues the Gemara, Omer Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Abba, Man Tana, who's the opinion, and we already saw this before on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, there's what the Tana who says, Shinui b'moyed b'dovar ha'ovid, even when you're doing a malacha, an activity that you're allowed to do to avoid a loss, nonetheless you have to do it with a shinui in an unusual way. Deloik Rabbi Yosi, it's clearly not like Rabbi Yosi, because we saw in these 2 Mishnayos, Rabbi Yosi says that once you're allowed to do the activity, you can do the whole thing in a usual manner and finish off the whole work. Says the Gemara, Omer of Yosef, Halacha Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosef says the halacha is like Rabbi Yosi, that once you're allowed to do the work because of Dava Ovid, you can do the whole work and you can do it kedarkoi. Says the Gemara, Bol min name of Nachman Bar Yitzchak. They asked of Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Mahu lemeisha chavito deshichra b'choyle demoyada. Are you allowed to seal a barrel of beer on Chol HaMoed? Is it a loss? Is it not a loss? Are you allowed to do that? Says the Gemara, Omar luhu, Sinai Omar halacha Rav Yosef, halacha Rav Yosi. Sinai, which is the term used for Rav Yosef, who was had an extremely broad knowledge, and so that's why he was given the title of Sinai, which is where we got the whole breadth of Torah. So Sinai already said a few lines earlier, halacha Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi said that something which could get ruined if you don't do it, you can do it and you can seal it properly, because Lemeisha is to seal. The machlokes of Rabbi Yosi and the Rabbanon is it gof kedarkoi? Can you seal it properly or not? Rabbi Yosi said that you can. Rabbi Yehuda said you can't. So here the Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said that Rav Yosef said the halacha was like Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi says that you can seal it kedarkoi, and therefore, since this beer may get ruined if you don't close the barrel, if you don't protect it, you're allowed to even seal it properly. Says the Gemara, Eimer de Omer Rabbi Yosi b'chamra b'shichra mi Omer. Now we're asking a question on Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. It's true that Rav Yosi said that. It's true that Rav Yosef said that the halacha was like Rabbi Yosi, but maybe that's only regarding wine. Well, obviously, it's also with oil, but maybe only with wine. But b'shichra mi Omer, maybe with beer, which is less expensive, and maybe over there won't be a loss. And therefore, even Rabbi Yosi will agree you cannot seal it properly. Says the Gemara, no. Chamra tamamai. Why does Rabbi Yosi say that you can seal a barrel of wine? Mishum denofish pseida. Because the losses are very great. Shichra nami ispe pseida. With a beer also, there are losses. There is what to lose if you don't seal it. If you don't close the barrel. Abaya said, Omro li aim, my mother. It wasn't really his mother. He didn't have a mother. His mother died when he was very young. Is talking about the nursemaid that looked after him, and his nursemaid told him, Bar shis soy v'shia. I'd rather get a barrel, a container the size of 6 sa, but sealed with beer, rather than mibar tamni, rather than a container with 8 sa of beer, veloishi, and not sealed. So you see that a sealed and closed container is always better, and therefore, since if you leave it open, it will get ruined. Therefore, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak held that Rabbi Yosi would say, even with beer, that you're allowed to seal the barrel. Omer of Choma bar Guria Omer Rav, who said in the name of Rav, Hilchos Moed, the halachas of Chol HaMoed are kehilchos kutim b'halacha. They like the halachas of the kutim. What was interesting was these kutim, they kept some halachas, they didn't keep others. Whatever they kept very well. Whatever they didn't keep, they didn't keep. And the halacha is regarding kutim that anything you know on a definite, on a 100% level, they keep it, you can rely on them. But you cannot assume that because they're keeping X, they're also keeping Y. No. The same as Hilchas Chol HaMoed, that if you know something is mutter, the Chachomim said you can do something, you can do that. But you cannot assume that because A is mutter, B is mutter. No, because in Hilchas Chol HaMoed it's very difficult to compare one thing to another. And the Gemara is going to explain that Lemay Hilchasa, what's the halachic ramifications of comparing the halachas of Chol HaMoed to the halachas of the Kutim. Omer of Daniel bar Katina Omer Rav, Loimar shein akuros. They're like a barren woman. A barren woman, you have her, but you have no offspring. There's nothing that comes from it. There's nothing that comes consequent to it. So too, that with these halachas, ve'ein lemeidos zu mizu, you cannot learn one situation from another. And the Omar Shmuel, because Shmuel said, Zoiv sin kuzta, ve'ein zoiv sin chavita. You're allowed to coat with pitch. If they used to have these earthenware containers, and if you didn't coat them, they would leak. And the halacha is, Shmuel said, that you're allowed to coat with this pitch a kuzta, a jug, ve'ein zoiv sin chavita, but not a barrel. Rav Dimi min Arda Omar, Rav Dimi of Narda said, Zoiv sin chavita, ve'in zoiv sin kuzota. The other way around. You're allowed to coat a barrel with this pitch, ve'in zoiv sin kuzta, but a smaller jug, you're not allowed to. And so that means they were clearly not comparing the kuzta to the chavita or to the chavita to the kuzta. Mar, Rav Dimi, who said that you're allowed to coat the barrel and not the jug, chayesh lepseida. He says that our primary concern is loss. And since with a barrel which has got much more content in it, there's much more that he stands to lose, and therefore on Chol HaMoed you can coat it with pitch to prevent it from leaking. However, a jug, no, because it's much smaller, there's not so much to lose, so you cannot do that on Chol HaMoed. Umar, however, Shmuel, who said the other way around, Shmuel, who said that you're allowed to coat a jug but not a barrel, he says chayesh letircha. He says there's another element of Hilchas Chol HaMoed, which is the amount of effort. He said to coat a small jug with pitch is not so much effort, you can do that on Chol HaMoed. To coat a whole barrel, that's a lot of work, you cannot do that on Chol HaMoed. So you see that even though we have rules about pseida and we have rules about tircha, you cannot just compare one to the other. Whatever the Chachomim say is mutter, is mutter. As the Gemara said, we've mentioned a few times in Chagiga Daf Yud Ches, that Moke Menichu LeChachomim, the Torah said that the Chachmei Hador decide and determine what's allowed, what's not allowed, but do not assume that you can compare one thing to the other. Omer Abaya, Noktinon Hilchas Moed Kehilchas Shabbos. Abaye said that we compare on some level, there's some similarity between the halachas of Chol HaMoed and the halachas of Shabbos. Yesh me'en potur aval osur, yesh me'en mutar. Look at Chila, like in Hilchos Shabbos. Some things are mutar, some things are asa. In Shabbos there's also some things that are chayev. In Hilchos Chol HaMoed it's never going to be chayev. There's no chiyuv malchus and no chiyuv misa like you have Shabbos, but you have some things that are mutar, some things that are asa. So too, regarding Hilchos Chol HaMoed, some things are mutar, like we just saw now. Some containers you can coat with pitch, and some containers you can't. Some are mutar, and some are asa. Continues the Gemara. Rav Huna chatztu leichatzta b'moed. Rav Huna had a field, and they reaped the harvest of his field. His workers obviously reaped the harvest of his field on Chol HaMoed. And Rav Huna obviously had what to eat, because we've learned, and we're going to learn, that if you don't have what to eat, then you're allowed to do these melachos l'tzorech moed. He had what to eat, and his workers, they would reap his harvest on Chol HaMoed. Esvei Rabba bar Rav Huna l'Rav Huna. Rabba bar Rav Huna asked his father Rav Huna, and he asked him a question. Did we not learn that toichan in kemach b'moed l'tzorech hamoed, you're only allowed to grind flour for as much as you need for Yom Tov, for Chol HaMoed, v'sheloi l'tzorech hamoed, but if you don't need it for the moed, also you're not allowed to. Davar she'avud, something which if you don't do it, you're going to incur a loss. Davar she'avud b'moed mutar lasoise b'moed. So if you're going to lose by not doing it on Chol HaMoed, you can do it on Chol HaMoed. Davar she'eino avud b'moed, also, but something which is not going to incur a loss if you don't do it on Chol HaMoed, you're not allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed. When is that true that it depends if it's davar avud or not davar avud? Betlushim, only if it's detached from the ground, min akarka, from the earth. Avul mechuber lekarka. But if it's attached to the ground, for example, when you reap something, when you're reaping the harvest, it's still attached to the ground. Afilu kulei avud, even in the event that the whole thing would get ruined. Also, it's also to do it on Chol HaMoed. If he doesn't have what to eat, then Kaitzer is allowed to reap, Ma'amir and gather, V'dosh and thresh, V'zoira and winnow, Boira and select, U'teichen and grind, or Bilvad shelo yidosh b'poris, on condition that you don't do the disha, you don't do the thrashing with oxen. But what did we see in this brisa? In this brisa it says that you're not, unless you haven't got what to eat, you're not allowed to detach, reap the produce of the fields. So how could the workers of Rav Huna be chotz tulei chatzta? How could they reap his harvest on Chol HaMoed? That is what Rabba asked his father Rav Huna. Omar le Rav Huna answered him, Yechidahi. This brisa is the opinion of an individual. It's not the accepted halacha. And we, says Rav Huna, do not hold like it, because that brisa is only following Rabbi Yosi. The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, Klal Omer Reb Shimon ben Gamliel mishum Rabbi Yosi. Shimon ben Gamliel said a rule in the name of Rabbi Yosi, that dova tolush min hakarka, something which is detached from the ground, afile miktsase avud, even if only a small part of it would get ruined if you don't do work with it, mutter, you're allowed to do what it takes not to have any losses. V'hamechuber lekarka, but if it's attached to the ground, afilu kulei avud, even if the whole thing would get ruined, also it's also. So you see that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel said this in the name of Rabbi Yosi. And this brisa that we just mentioned, that Rabba mentioned to his father Rav Huna, is obviously following Rabbi Yosi. He's an individual opinion, and therefore the halacha is not like him. Says that V'i Rabbi Yosi, says the Gemara says, now, if that brisa that you first mentioned, that Rabba bar Rav Huna mentioned, was Rabbi Yosi, and we would say that because the brisa says that there's a difference between tolush and mechubar, then yidosh nami b'paris. Then why is he not allowed? Why can he not do the disha, the thrashing, in the event that he's allowed to do it because he hasn't got what to eat? Why does the brisa say you shouldn't use oxen? Ha'omer Yitzchok bar Abba. Man tonish shinui b'moed b'dava ovid deloi Rabbi Yosi. Did we not see in the Gemara on Amud Aleph that Rabbi Yosi, and it's apparent in the two Mishnayos we saw on Yud Aleph Amud Beis and Yud Beis Amud Aleph, Rabbi Yosi says that whenever you're allowed to do a melacha, you don't need to do it with a shinui. So if this brisa is indeed Rabbi Yosi, who is stringent by mechubar, if you have what to eat, then why is the brisa being stringent and saying that you shouldn't use oxen? Rabbi Yosi is lenient in that aspect and says that when you haven't got what to eat and you're allowed to do it, you can do it kedarkoi. Why is the brisa say not with the oxen? Omar l'cha hachanami. Kiven de kol yoyma lav b'poris daisha ha'idna nami lav shinuyehu. The truth is that if you always did the disha, the threshing with oxen, you're allowed to. The Braisa is talking about somebody who never does it with oxen. Because we thought the Braisa says, don't do it with oxen, even though you normally do, because you should do it with a shinui. And we asked a question, the Braisa is Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi says you don't need a shinui. The answer is no, the Braisa is not talking about a shinui. The Braisa is saying that you never did it with oxen. So you don't need to do it with oxen now either. But not because it's a shinui. But you can ask me a question so don't say anything. If he does it with oxen, he does it with oxen. If he doesn't do it, he doesn't do it. If it's Rabbi Yosi, and Rabbi Yosi says you don't need a shinui, why at all are you saying don't use oxen? So that Rashi adds on, and he says, since you never do it with oxen, then it's av shemilsahi. That because it's very noisy, and when oxen thresh, then it's a big commotion, and therefore, since you don't normally do it, if you always do it with oxen, then Rabbi Yosi would say you can continue doing it with oxen. You don't need a change. You don't need to do it with a shinui. But if you don't normally do it, don't do it with oxen on Chol HaMoed. Continues the Gemara Tanu Rabbanon. Toichanin b'moed letzorech hamoed. You're allowed to grind on Chol HaMoed if you need it for Chol HaMoed or Yom Tov. V'shaloi letzorech hamoed, but to grind when you don't need it for the moed, also that's also. V'im tochan, and if you did grind, you ground whatever you thought you needed, and then you didn't need it at the end. You had some left over. V'hoiser, you've got some left over. Harei mutter. Even though it transpired retroactively that you did grinding on Chol HaMoed that you didn't need to do, nonetheless, you're allowed to use this flour after Yom Tov. Koitzitzin eitzim, you're allowed to cut down branches b'moed letzorech hamoed if you need it for the moed. V'shaloi letzorech hamoed, if you don't need it for the moed, also then you're not allowed to. V'im kotzatz, and if you cut down the branches v'hoiser, and then there's some left over, you didn't need it for moed, harei mutter, you can still use them whenever you need them. Another halacha says the Braisa, matilin sheichor b'moed, you're allowed to brew beer on Chol HaMoed letzorech hamoed. V'shaloi letzorech hamoed, also. V'im hitil, if you brewed beer v'hoiser and then you have some left over, harei mutter, it's mutter, or belvad shelo yarim, on condition that you don't do a scheme, you don't fake it, you don't say, I need it, and I'm doing it for the moed, and in actual fact, you intended initially that it should be left over for after Chol HaMoed. That you're not allowed to do. Says the Gemara, you're not allowed to do such a scheme and sort of fake it and just say to yourself and to others, I'm doing it for Chol HaMoed, when in truth, it's not really the whole truth. Or a minu. You're saying that's also. This seems to contradict what we learned in Maseches Shabbos. Matilin sheichar b'moed letzorech hamoed, you're allowed to brew this beer on Chol HaMoed letzorech hamoed v'shaloi letzorech hamoed aser. Echad sheichar. This is true for beer of tmorim. Sheichar tmorim is date beer. Ve'echad sheichar sa'irim, and barley beer. Ve'afal pi sheyesh le'yashon. Even though you have beer, you have a stock of beer in the house that would take you through Yom Tov. Marim, you can just fake it, so to speak, and make new beer, v'shoisam min hachodosh, and drink from the new beer. So you see that you are allowed to make new beer even though you didn't really need it. So why did we say before, or bilvad shelo yarim? Answers the Gemara, Tanoihi. This concept of yarim, of lo yarim, is actually a machlekes Tanoim, the Tanya, ein ma'arimim bekach. The Braisa says that, and there's a sugya in Shabbos Taf Kuf Yud Zayin, that in certain situations you shouldn't do a ha'aroma. Only be completely straight. Rabbi Yosi bar Yehuda marimim. Rabbi Yosi bar Yehuda said in that case you are allowed to be marimim. So too here, there's one Braisa that says that marimim, that marim v'shoisam min hachodosh, you're allowed to make new beer and say, I want to use this on Chol HaMoed, I want to use this on Yom Tov, and he'll drink the new beer. But you didn't really need the new beer, you had a stock of beer. So the Tana that says that you're allowed to do that is Rabbi Yosi bar Yehuda. When we saw before where it says uvilvad shelo yarim, that's the other Tana, the Tana Kama, that says ein marimim. Continues the Gemara, Rav chotztulei chatzta b'choyle demoyado. They reaped the harvest of Rav's field on Chol HaMoed. Shoma Shmuel. Shmuel heard about this, ikbid, and he was very upset about it, and he really held it was the wrong thing. Leima Shmuel kechida, svirele. Are you suggesting that Shmuel, or is that the only way to understand Shmuel, that he holds like the Rabbi Yossi we mentioned before, that anything that's attached to the ground, you're not allowed to, even to prevent it from getting destroyed, you're not allowed to do the malachas on Chol HaMoed, and that's why he was annoyed that Rav had it done in his field? Says the Gemara, Loi. No. Chatzto de Chite Hava, it was talking about the wheat harvest, that Deloy have a pasid. There would have been no pseda. If there would have been a loss, then Shmuel doesn't hold the Rabbi Yossi. And Shmuel says to prevent a loss, you're allowed to do malach on Chol HaMoed. The reason I was annoyed that Rav did it is because it was talking about the wheat it's talking about wheat, and wheat doesn't get ruined if you don't harvest it right away. The question is, if there's no loss, how could Rav allow them to do that if there was not to prevent loss? On Chol HaMoed, you're not allowed to work if you don't need to. Answers the Gemara, he didn't have what to eat, and therefore he was allowed to harvest as much as he needed to be able to eat. Or Shmuel asks the Gemara, so if Rav needed it, so why is Shmuel annoyed that he did it? He's allowed to do it. They didn't tell him that Rav didn't have anything else to eat, and he was unaware of that, and that's why he was annoyed. Inami, or it could be Odom Choshuv Shani, it could be that Shmuel understood that a prominent person like Rav should have been stringent, even though he didn't have what to eat. Nonetheless, he should not have harvested his fields on Chol HaMoed. Now obviously he doesn't need to die of starvation, and it's obviously talking about, and the Mefarshim discussed this, it could be that there was food to be purchased in a store, and therefore he didn't have to reap his fields and reap the harvest. And therefore Shmuel said, even though a regular person who doesn't have food to eat, he's allowed to go to his field, he doesn't have to acquire it some other way. But for a prominent person, any work should not be done in his fields on Chol HaMoed. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda the Nasi, Nofak, he went out to a courtyard, Bechumrasa de Madusha, with a ring that had a wooden signet, which means it wasn't an ornament, and therefore it's a complicated sugya which we don't need to go into now. We learnt about this in Maseches Shabbos, Maseches Eruvin, that there were certain types of rings that we're afraid if you're going to go out to a Shus Rabbim, you might by mistake take them off, and these rings are not allowed to be worn, and they're actually muktzah. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya went out into his chotza with one of these rings that were muktzah. And also, V'ishte maya da'ochim kfei la'armo. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, he drank water that was heated up by a non-Jewish cook. A kfeila is a cook, armo, an Armenian cook, a Goysha cook. Shama Reb Ami. Reb Ami heard of these two things that Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya did, ikpid, and he was annoyed and he was very makpid that Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya did that. Omer Rav Yosef commented on Reb Ami and says, "My tam ikpid, why are you annoyed? Like, what did Rav Yehuda Nasiya do wrong? Imishum chumrasa de madusha. Do you think it was not okay that he took out this ring that had a wooden signet on it, and because of muktzah? Hotanya, did we not learn in a brisa that hashirin, the brooches, vanazomim, and the nose rings, vatabois, and the rings, harehein kekol kelim hanitorin b'chotzer, that as long as you're in the chotzer, you're not carrying them outside in Rosh Hashanah, then if you need to move them, you either need the space or you need them for something that's mutter to be done on Shabbos, you're allowed to move them. And therefore Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, he moved this ring because he was allowed to move it in his chotzer. Imishum, are you annoyed that the Ishti Maya, the Ochim Kfei La'armo, he drank the water that was heated up by a non-Jewish cook? Ha'omar Shmuel bar Yitzchak Omar Rav, was it not said in the name of Rav that the whole issue of Bishul Akum, of not eating things that were cooked by a goy, doesn't always apply? Kol shenechal k'mois shehu chai, anything that could be consumed, eaten or drunk in its raw state and didn't need to be cooked, then even if a guy cooked it, there's no isser of bishul nachrim. We're going to learn more about bishul nachrim later on in Shasim Yirtzeh Hashem, that why the Chachomim made a gezerah not to eat from things cooked by a goy, but that only applies on something that needs to be cooked. Water can be drunk when it's not cooked, so therefore there was no issue of bishul akum. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya was allowed to drink that water. So why were you annoyed, Rabbi Ami? Answers the Gemara, Odom Choshuv Shani. Rav Ami held that you're right. Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, he was allowed to move these rings. They were muktzah, but let's say you were allowed to move them. A prominent person should have been more stringent. The water is Bishul Akum, but there's no Issa of Bishul Akum, as we said. Nonetheless, a prominent person should avoid consuming anything that was heated up by a goy. Continues the Gemara, Omar Rav Chananel, Omar Rav. Was said in the name of Rav, Koitzitz Odom Dekel B'moed, you're allowed to cut down a palm tree on Chol HaMoed, Afal Pi she'einei tzorich elo l'naseiros sheloi. Even though you don't need the whole tree, you just need the sawdust, the wood shavings. You need that for Chol HaMoed, for Yom Tov. You're allowed to cut down a tree on Chol HaMoed. Lait alo Abaya. Abaya, he cursed him, he responded very negatively to this psak. If all you need is a little bit of sawdust, and if you don't have it, how big can the damages be? That would not justify to cut down a tree on Chol HaMoed. Says the Gemara of Ashi, Havele Abba B'Shulanya. Rav Ashi owned a forest in the place called Shalanya. Ozal Lemikzayo, he went to cut down a tree in that forest because he needed the sawdust, he needed these shavings. And he did it on Chol HaMoed. Omar le Rav Shila Mishulanya, Rav Shila from that place Shulanya said to Rav Ashi, who he saw Rav Ashi doing this, "My dadcha, what are you thinking? Why are you allowed to cut down this tree on Chol HaMoed?" Duka Omar of Chananel Omar Rav, is it because you heard in the name of Rav that Koitzitz Odom Dekel B'moed Afal Pi she'einei tzorich elo l'naseiros sheloi? Is it because you heard about Rav that we just mentioned a couple of lines ago? Holayet halo Abaya, did you not hear that Abaya, he was very much responded negatively to that quote from Rav? Omar le, so Rav Ashi answered back to Rav Shila and said, Lo shamirli, I didn't hear what Abaya said. He did hear. Koloima, what did he mean by I didn't hear? Lo svirli. I don't agree with Abaya. I agree with what Rav initially said, that even though you only need the wood shavings, you're allowed to cut down the tree. So he cut down the tree. Ishtamit narga, the axe slipped, and boya lemifsuke leshakya, and it almost severed his thigh. So this Rav Ashi, he realized, if something like this happened to me, it might be because Abaya cursed this ruling. Maybe I should have followed what Abaya said and not cut down this tree. Shavke v'hada asa, he left the forest and he went back home. Continues the Gemara, Rav Yehuda Shara, Rav Yehuda allowed l'me'aker kisna, to uproot flax, u'lemiktal keshusa, and to cut down a keshusa, another type of vegetation, u'leme'aker, and to uproot shumshumi, another type of food. Omale Abaye Rav Yosef. Abaye asked Rav Yosef, Bishlei mekisna, flax I can understand why you should be allowed to cut it down on Chol HaMoed. Because chazi lechafifa, because you can use the flax and what you've cut down to cover over some food that needs to be covered over. Keshusa, I can understand why you should cut down keshusa, chazi leshichra, because it can be used for brewing beer. It was one of the ingredients that helped the beer, and that you can need for Chol HaMoed, for Yom Tov. Elo shumshimi lemay chazi. But with shumshimi, that if you cut down this shumshimi, you cannot use it all the while that it's not being dried out. And you're not going to have time to do that on Chol HaMoed. So what tzorech HaMoed could there be to cut down these shumshimi? Lemay chazi, what's it fit for? Says the Gemara, chazi lenazaya de'isbehu. He says, within these shumshimi seeds, there are some that have been withered and are able to be consumed as they are. They're able to be used as they are without needing to wait for them to dry out. And since I can use those on Chol HaMoed, I can cut the shumshimi. Continues the Gemara, Rav Yanai havaleahu paradesa. Rav Yanai had this orchard. The moto zmane, the time to pick the fruits, b'chol HaMoed, was on Chol HaMoed. Katfe, and he cut down the fruits on Chol HaMoed because that's the time where he needed to cut them down. Leshano, the next year, Shihiyua kule alma, all the other people, they waited till Chol HaMoed, lepardosayu, with their orchards, lechol HaMoed. That means they thought if Rav Yanai can pick his fruits on Chol HaMoed, so it's obviously okay to pick fruits on Chol HaMoed. So the next year, they just waited till Chol HaMoed in order to pick their fruits. There's a fruit picking activity for Chol HaMoed, and that's seriously also. It was only mutter for Rabbi Yanai because it was the time that he had to pick them then. So Rabbi Yanai, so to speak, he punished himself because what he did innocently misled other people. And Afkare Rabbi Yanai leParadesei, he abandoned his field to the poor people, Hahu Shata, that year, so to speak, to punish himself for having misled the people. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next shir, we're going to continue the next Mishnah.